The rain hammered against the wooden shutters of the lonely rancher's cabin like bullets from a Colt 45, each drop carrying the weight of the storm that had been brewing over Dodge City for 3 days straight. At 43, the lonely rancher had weathered more storms than most men twice his age, but something about this particular tempest felt different, ominous, as if the very heavens were warning of troubles yet to come. Lightning split the Kansas sky, illuminating the vast expanse of his ranch in stark, ghostly white. The lonely rancher stood at his window, nursing a cup of bitter coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching his cattle huddled together beneath the sparse shelter of cottonwood trees. 20 years of working this unforgiving land had taught him to read the signs. And tonight, every instinct screamed that this storm was just the beginning. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." "Easy there, Thunder," he murmured to his faithful horse, who whinnied nervously from the stable. The black stallion had been his companion for 8 years, and like his master, Thunder possessed an uncanny ability to sense when trouble was riding on the wind. The lonely rancher pulled on his worn leather coat and stepped into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through to his skin, but he pressed forward toward the creek that bordered his property. Something had been nagging at him all evening, a feeling he couldn't shake that something was wrong down by the water. In his years of solitude, he'd learned to trust these inexplicable hunches. As he approached the swollen creek, another flash of lightning revealed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, partially hidden beneath the drooping branches of a weeping willow, sat a wicker basket. But this wasn't just any discarded item. Soft, whimpering sounds carried on the wind, barely audible above the storm's fury. "What in tarnation?" he breathed, quickening his pace. The lonely rancher knelt beside the basket, his weathered hands trembling as he pulled back the soaked blanket. Inside, a baby girl no more than 6 months old gazed up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was cold, wet, and clearly terrified, but alive. Her tiny fist clutched a piece of expensive lace, the kind only the wealthy families in Dodge City could afford. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, carefully lifting the child from the basket. "What are you doing out here, little one?" The baby's cries intensified as he held her against his chest, her small body shivering uncontrollably. Without hesitation, the lonely rancher wrapped her in his coat and hurried back to the cabin. Inside, he quickly built up the fire and searched through his meager belongings for something suitable to warm and feed the child. "Looks like it's just you and me tonight, sweetheart," he said softly, fashioning a makeshift crib from a wooden crate and some old blankets. "Don't you worry none. Old Lonely's gonna take care of you." As the storm raged outside, the lonely rancher found himself pacing the small cabin, the baby finally sleeping peacefully in his arms. Questions swirled through his mind like the wind outside. Who would abandon such a beautiful child in the middle of a storm? Why leave her so far from town? And most troubling of all, why did he have the sinking feeling that whoever had done this wouldn't want her found? The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. The lonely rancher had barely slept, spending the night watching over the baby and feeding her small amounts of milk from his one remaining cow. As the sun climbed higher, he knew he couldn't keep the child's presence a secret much longer. Someone in Dodge City had to be looking for her. He saddled Thunder and carefully secured the baby in a sling across his chest, then rode toward town. Dodge City was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Cowboys preparing for cattle drives, merchants opening their shops, and the usual collection of gamblers and drifters who never seemed to sleep. The lonely rancher's first stop was Doc Morrison's office. The elderly physician had been serving Dodge City for over 30 years and knew every family within 100 miles. "Doc, you got a minute?" the lonely rancher called, dismounting outside the small medical office. Doc Morrison emerged, wiping his hands on a clean towel. His eyes immediately fell on the bundle in the lonely rancher's arms. "Well, I'll be switched. Where did you find her?" "Down by my creek after the storm. Someone left her in a basket." The lonely rancher's voice was tight with controlled anger. Any idea who she might belong to? Doc Morrison examined the baby carefully, his experienced hands gentle as he checked her health. She's in good condition, considering. Well-fed, well cared for until recently. He paused, studying the expensive lace dress the child wore. This fabric, I've only seen quality like this on one family in these parts. Which family? The lonely rancher pressed. The Callahans, Doc Morrison said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. But that doesn't make sense. Word around town is that Margaret Callahan lost her baby girl 3 months ago. Stillborn, they said. The lonely rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Callahan family owned the largest ranch in the county and wielded considerable influence in Dodge City. Silas Callahan was known for his ruthless business practices and explosive temper, while his wife Margaret was rarely seen in public anymore. Doc, if this baby belongs to the Callahans, why would they abandon her? Doc Morrison's face darkened. Son, there are some questions in this town that are better left unasked. The Callahans, they're not people you want to cross. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed down the main street. The lonely rancher turned to see a group of riders led by Silas Callahan himself, an imposing man with steel-gray hair and cold, calculating eyes. Behind him rode his foreman, Jake Murdoch, and 3 other ranch hands, all armed and looking grim. Looks like word travels fast in this town, the lonely rancher muttered. Silas Callahan dismounted and approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. I hear you found something that belongs to me, stranger. The lonely rancher instinctively tightened his hold on the baby. Depends on what you're looking for, Callahan. My daughter, Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled fury. The one you took from my property. Took? The lonely rancher's own anger flared. I found this child abandoned in a basket by the creek, half dead from cold and exposure. If she's yours, then you've got some explaining to do. The tension in the street was palpable as other townspeople began to gather, sensing the confrontation brewing between the 2 men. The lonely rancher could see fear in many of their faces, fear of Silas Callahan and what he might do to anyone who crossed him. But as he looked down at the innocent child in his arms, the lonely rancher knew that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The storm had brought him more than just rain. It had brought him a choice that would define not only his own future, but the very soul of Dodge City itself. The standoff in the middle of Dodge City's main street stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. The lonely rancher could feel the weight of every eye upon him as Silas Callahan stepped closer, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden planks with the rhythm of a death march. Hand over my daughter, and we'll forget this unfortunate misunderstanding, Silas said, his voice smooth as snake oil, but carrying an unmistakable threat. The lonely rancher studied the man before him. Silas Callahan was everything he despised about the changing West, wealthy, entitled, and willing to crush anyone who stood in his way. But it was the cold emptiness in the man's eyes when he looked at the baby that truly chilled the lonely rancher's blood. Funny thing about misunderstandings, the lonely rancher replied, his voice steady despite the tension. They usually involve someone not telling the truth. Doc Morrison here tells me your wife lost her baby 3 months ago. Stillborn, he said. A muscle twitched in Silas's jaw. Doc Morrison is an old fool who drinks too much and remembers even less. This is my daughter, and I want her back. Now. From the gathered crowd, a soft voice spoke up. That's not what you told us, Mr. Callahan. Everyone turned to see Mary O'Brien, the young Irish woman who ran the town's only boarding house. Her face was pale, but determined as she stepped forward. 3 months ago, you and your wife came to town wearing black. You told everyone the baby had died. We even held a memorial service. Silas's face darkened like a storm cloud. You'd do well to mind your own business, girl. When it comes to the welfare of a child, it is my business, Mary shot back, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. I've seen enough suffering in my life to recognize it when I see it. The lonely rancher felt a surge of respect for the young woman's courage. In a town where most people cowered before the Callahan name, she was willing to speak the truth. But he also saw the fear in her eyes and knew she was risking everything by standing up to Silas. Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. The lonely rancher had known Tom for years. He was a good man trying to keep the peace in an increasingly lawless town, but he was also practical enough to know which battles he could win. "All right, everyone calm down," Sheriff Bradley said, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Silas, if this is your daughter, you'll need to provide some proof. Birth records, witnesses, something official." Silas's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Proof? I'm Silas Callahan. My word should be proof enough in this town." "Not when a child's welfare is at stake," the lonely rancher interjected. "Sheriff, I found this baby abandoned and nearly dead from exposure. Until we know the truth about who she belongs to and why she was left to die, I'm not handing her over to anyone." The baby stirred in his arms, making soft cooing sounds that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Several women in the crowd moved closer, their maternal instincts clearly aroused by the sight of the innocent child. "Look at her," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife. "She's beautiful. How could anyone abandon such a precious little thing?" Silas's foreman, Jake Murdoch, stepped forward. Jake was a hard man with dead eyes and a reputation for violence. "Boss, you want me to take care of this?" The threat was clear, and the lonely rancher saw several townspeople step back in fear. But he stood his ground, shifting slightly to better protect the baby while keeping his gun hand free. "I wouldn't recommend it, Jake," the lonely rancher said quietly. "I may be outnumbered, but I guarantee you won't like how this ends." Sheriff Bradley quickly moved between the two men. "Nobody's taking care of anything with violence. This is a matter for the law to decide." "Then decide it," Silas snapped. "I want my property returned." "Property?" The words escaped the lonely rancher's lips like a growl. "This is a human being, not a piece of livestock." For a moment, something flickered in Silas's eyes. Was it guilt? Fear? But it was gone so quickly the lonely rancher wondered if he'd imagined it. "Sheriff," came another voice from the crowd. Old Pete, the town drunk, shuffled forward. Most people ignored Pete, but the lonely rancher had always treated him with respect. "Sheriff, I seen something that night. The night of the big storm." Everyone turned to look at the old man, whose clothes were tattered but whose eyes were surprisingly clear. "I was sleeping in the alley behind the saloon when I heard horses. Looked out and saw a fancy carriage heading out of town, real quiet-like. Recognized it as the Callahan carriage." "You were drunk," Jake Murdoch snarled. "Nobody's going to believe the word of a worthless drunk." "Maybe," Pete said with dignity, "but I know what I saw. And I saw that carriage come back about an hour later, moving even quieter than before." The lonely rancher felt the pieces of a dark puzzle beginning to come together. "Sheriff, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this. Somewhere private." Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. "Agreed. Silas, I'm going to need you to come to my office and provide that proof we talked about. Until then, the child stays in protective custody." "Protective custody with whom?" Silas demanded. The sheriff looked around the crowd, his gaze finally settling on the lonely rancher. "With the man who found her and has been caring for her. Seems like she's in good hands." Silas's face turned red with rage. "This is outrageous. I'll have your badge for this, Bradley." "You're welcome to try," the sheriff replied calmly. "But until you can prove this child is yours and explain why she was abandoned in a storm, my decision stands." As the crowd began to disperse, the lonely rancher noticed several people approaching him quietly. Mary O'Brien was the first to reach him. "If you need anything for the baby, food, clothes, medicine, you come to me," she said softly. "I don't have much, but what I have is yours." Mrs. Henderson nodded in agreement. "Same here. That little one deserves better than what she's been through." Even old Pete shuffled over. "You watch yourself, rancher. The Callahans don't forget, and they don't forgive, but you're doing the right thing." As the lonely rancher rode back to his ranch with the baby secure in his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just declared war on the most powerful family in the county. But every time he looked down at the innocent child who had been entrusted to his care, he knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. The storm had passed, But the lonely rancher suspected that darker clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Whatever secrets the Callahan family was hiding, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. Back in town, Silas Callahan stood in the sheriff's office, his facade of control finally cracking. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, Bradley." "Then enlighten me," the sheriff replied. "Because right now, all I see is a man who can't explain why his supposedly dead daughter was found abandoned in a storm." Silas's silence spoke volumes, and Sheriff Bradley knew that the lonely rancher had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of abandonment. The question was, would they be able to uncover the truth before the Callahans silenced them permanently? 3 days had passed since the confrontation in town, and the lonely rancher had settled into an unexpected routine. The baby, whom he'd taken to calling Hope, had proven to be a surprisingly easy child to care for. She slept peacefully through the nights and seemed content during the days, as if she somehow understood that she was finally safe. But safety, the lonely rancher knew, was an illusion in Dodge City when you'd made an enemy of Silas Callahan. He was feeding Hope her morning milk when Thunder's warning whinny alerted him to approaching riders. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Bradley riding up alone, his face grim with the weight of bad news. "Morning, Tom," the lonely rancher called out as he stepped onto the porch, Hope cradled in his arms. "You look like a man who's seen better days." Sheriff Bradley dismounted slowly, his movements betraying his exhaustion. "Haven't slept much since our little gathering in town. Been doing some investigating into the Callahan situation. Find anything interesting?" "More than I bargained for," the sheriff replied, accepting the cup of coffee the lonely rancher offered. "Talked to Doc Morrison again, this time without half the town listening. He told me something that changes everything." The lonely rancher waited, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "Margaret Callahan didn't lose her baby 3 months ago," Sheriff Bradley continued. "She gave birth to a healthy daughter. But 2 weeks later, Doc was called out to the Callahan ranch for an emergency. When he got there, he found Margaret beaten so badly she could barely speak. The lonely rancher felt his blood run cold. Silas? Doc couldn't prove it, but Margaret's injuries were consistent with a severe beating. Broken ribs, bruised face, the works. And the baby? Margaret kept asking about the baby, but Silas told Doc the child had died suddenly. Said they'd already buried her, but she didn't die. No, she didn't. I think Silas took that baby away from Margaret to punish her for something. Maybe she tried to protect the child from his temper. Maybe she threatened to leave him. Either way, he made sure she believed her daughter was dead. The lonely rancher looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms. The thought of anyone hurting this innocent child filled him with a rage he'd rarely experienced. "There's more," Sheriff Bradley continued. "I sent a telegram to the Territorial Marshal's office, asking about any complaints or investigations involving the Callahan family. Got a response yesterday that made my blood run cold." He pulled a folded telegram from his pocket and handed it to the lonely rancher. The message was brief, but chilling. 3 women married to Silas Callahan in past 15 years. First 2 died under suspicious circumstances. No investigations due to lack of evidence and Callahan influence. Proceed with extreme caution. Sweet Jesus, the lonely rancher breathed. Margaret's his 3rd wife? And if the pattern holds, she won't live much longer. I think taking Hope away was just the beginning. He's been slowly destroying Margaret's will to live, and when she finally gives up, he'll be free to find wife number 4, the lonely rancher finished grimly. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. This time, it wasn't a friendly visit. Jake Murdoch led a group of 6 armed men toward the ranch, their intentions clear from their aggressive posture. "Looks like Silas got tired of waiting for the law to work in his favor," Sheriff Bradley muttered, his hand moving to his gun. The lonely rancher quickly handed Hope to the sheriff. "Get her inside and keep her safe. This is about to get ugly." Jake Murdoch and his men stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "Rancher," Jake called out, "Mr. Callahan's patience has run out. Hand over the baby and nobody gets hurt. Tell Mister." Callahan that his daughter is safe and well cared for, the lonely rancher replied, stepping off the porch to face the men. She'll stay that way until we get to the bottom of why she was abandoned. You're outnumbered 6-1, Jake pointed out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. 6-2, Sheriff Bradley corrected, emerging from the cabin with his badge prominently displayed. And I'm here in an official capacity. Any man who draws on me will answer to territorial law. Jake's confidence wavered slightly. Killing a local rancher was one thing, but murdering a sheriff would bring federal marshals down on Dodge City like a plague of locusts. Sheriff, you're making a mistake, Jake said. Mr. Callahan has rights as a father. Rights he forfeited when he abandoned his child in a storm, the lonely rancher shot back. A child he told everyone was dead. One of Jake's men, a young cowboy named Billy, shifted nervously in his saddle. Jake, maybe we should— Shut up, Billy, Jake snapped. But the lonely rancher had caught the uncertainty in the young man's voice. Billy, isn't it? The lonely rancher called out. You look like a decent sort. You really want to be part of whatever Silas Callahan is planning? Billy's face flushed red. I just work for Mr. Callahan. I don't ask questions. Maybe it's time you started, Sheriff Bradley suggested. Because what we're talking about here isn't just abandonment. We're talking about a pattern of abuse and possibly murder. The word murder hung in the air like a death sentence. Several of Jake's men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking. You're all making a big mistake, Jake warned, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The only mistake would be letting an innocent child return to a home where she's not wanted or safe, the lonely rancher replied firmly. Suddenly, the sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop caught everyone's attention. Mary O'Brien rode into the yard, her face flushed with urgency and fear. Sheriff, Rancher, she called out breathlessly. You need to come to town right away. It's Margaret Callahan. She's asking for you. She says she has something to tell you about her baby. Jake's face went white. Mrs. O'Brien, you need to turn around and ride back to town. This doesn't concern you. Like hell it doesn't, Mary shot back with Irish fire. Margaret Callahan is dying and she wants to tell the truth before it's too late. Are you going to stop her? The standoff had suddenly shifted. Jake and his men found themselves facing not just the lonely rancher and Sheriff Bradley, but the moral weight of a dying woman's final testimony. Billy, the lonely rancher called out to the young cowboy, you've got a choice to make. You can be part of covering up the truth, or you can be part of setting it free. What's it going to be? Billy looked at Jake, then at his fellow riders, and finally at the cabin, where an innocent baby slept peacefully. Slowly, he holstered his gun. I'm sorry, Jake, Billy said quietly, but I can't be part of this anymore. One by one, the other men followed Billy's lead, until only Jake remained with his weapon drawn. Outnumbered and abandoned by his own men, Jake's bravado finally cracked. This isn't over, he snarled, but he too holstered his gun. As Jake and his men rode away in defeat, the lonely rancher felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally going to come to light, and with it, perhaps justice for Hope and her mother. But he also knew that Silas Callahan wouldn't give up easily. The most dangerous part of their fight was yet to come. The ride to town felt like a funeral procession, with the weight of impending revelation heavy in the air. The lonely rancher carried Hope close to his chest, while Sheriff Bradley and Mary O'Brien flanked him on either side. Behind them, in a surprising turn of events, Billy and two other former Callahan ranch hands followed, men whose consciences had finally overcome their fear. Dodge City buzzed with tension as word spread that Margaret Callahan was finally ready to speak. People lined the streets, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Everyone knew that whatever was about to unfold would change their town forever. Doc Morrison met them at his office, his face grave. She's very weak, he warned quietly. Whatever she has to say, it needs to be said quickly. Inside the small back room, Margaret Callahan lay propped up in bed, her once beautiful face bearing the faded marks of old bruises. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination that spoke of a woman who had found her courage in her darkest hour. Is she— Margaret's voice was barely a whisper as her gaze fell on the baby in the lonely rancher's arms. "She's safe," the lonely rancher assured her, moving closer so Margaret could see her daughter. "She's healthy and well cared for." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she reached out with trembling fingers to touch Hope's tiny hand. "My beautiful girl, I thought you were gone forever." Sheriff Bradley pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Mrs. Callahan, I need you to tell us everything, the whole truth." Margaret's story unfolded like a nightmare given voice. She spoke of Silas's increasing violence after Hope's birth, his rage when the baby would cry during his business meetings, his threats to get rid of the problem if Margaret couldn't control the child. "He said a crying baby was bad for business," Margaret whispered. "He wanted me to give her away, but I refused. So one night during the storm, he took her while I was sleeping. When I woke up, he told me she was dead. He showed me a tiny grave he'd dug behind the house and said if I ever spoke of it, he'd put me in the ground next to her." The room was silent except for Margaret's labored breathing and the soft sounds Hope made as she slept. "But she wasn't dead," Sheriff Bradley prompted gently. "No, he took her out to the creek and left her there to die. He thought the storm would finish what he couldn't bring himself to do." Margaret's voice broke. "My own husband tried to murder our daughter." Billy, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I worked for your husband, and I should have done something." Margaret looked at the young cowboy with surprising kindness. "You're here now, son. That's what matters." The door burst open, and Silas Callahan stormed in with Jake Murdoch at his side. "Margaret, what lies are you filling these people's heads with?" The transformation in Margaret was immediate and startling. The broken woman disappeared, replaced by a mother protecting her child. "They're not lies, Silas. They're the truth you've been trying to bury. You're sick, Margaret. Delirious. These people are taking advantage of your condition." "I'm dying, Silas," Margaret said with calm certainty. "Just like your first 2 wives died. But unlike them, I'm going to make sure." "Everyone knows what kind of monster you really are before I go." Silas's face turned purple with rage. "You ungrateful—" "That's enough," Sheriff Bradley interrupted, standing between Silas and the bed. "Silas Callahan, you're under arrest for child abandonment, attempted murder, and suspicion of murder in the deaths of your previous wives." "You can't prove anything," Silas snarled. "It's the word of a dying woman against a respected businessman." "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "we can prove quite a bit." Everyone turned to see a tall man in a federal marshal's badge standing in the entrance. Behind him were 3 deputies, all armed and ready for trouble. "Marshal Davis," Sheriff Bradley said with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here. Got your telegram, Sheriff. We've been investigating the Callahan family for months, following a trail of suspicious deaths and disappearances across 3 territories. Mrs. Callahan's testimony is exactly what we needed to close our case." Silas's bravado finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. I built this town. I employ half the people here. Without me, Dodge City is nothing." "Without you," the lonely rancher said quietly, "Dodge City might finally have a chance to become something decent." As the marshals moved to arrest Silas, Jake Murdoch made a desperate play for his gun, but Billy was faster, tackling his former colleague before he could draw his weapon. "It's over, Jake," Billy said firmly. "No more hurting innocent people." The crowd that had gathered outside erupted in cheers as Silas Callahan was led away in shackles. For the first time in years, the people of Dodge City felt like justice might actually be possible. Back in Doc Morrison's office, Margaret held her daughter one last time. "Promise me," she whispered to the lonely rancher. "Promise me you'll take care of her. Give her the life I never could." "I promise," the lonely rancher said solemnly. "She'll grow up knowing she's loved and wanted." Margaret smiled peacefully and closed her eyes. She passed away quietly that evening, finally free from the fear and pain that had defined her final years. 3 months later, the lonely rancher stood in the same spot where he'd first found hope. But now he wasn't alone. Mary O'Brien stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. They'd grown close during the long process of Hope's legal adoption, and what had started as mutual respect had blossomed into something deeper. "She's getting so big," Mary observed, watching Hope crawl through the grass, chasing butterflies with the fearless joy of a child who had never known anything but love and safety. "She's going to be a handful," the lonely rancher agreed with a smile. "Good thing she'll have both of us to keep her in line." Mary's engagement ring caught the sunlight as she reached down to scoop up Hope. The three of them made an unlikely family, but they were bound together by something stronger than blood. They were bound by choice, by love, and by the shared knowledge that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. Billy rode up to the house, now serving as the lonely rancher's foreman and one of Hope's most devoted protectors. "Boss, the new cattle arrived from Kansas City. Want me to get the boys started on moving them to the south pasture?" "Sounds good, Billy. And remember, supper's at 6. Mary's making her famous Irish stew." As Billy rode away with a grin, the lonely rancher reflected on how much his life had changed since that stormy night. He was no longer lonely. He was surrounded by family, friends, and a community that had learned the true meaning of standing up for what's right. Hope gurgled happily in Mary's arms, reaching up to touch her face with tiny, trusting fingers. In those innocent eyes, the lonely rancher saw not just the future, but the promise that sometimes, against all odds, love really could conquer all. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had left something beautiful. A family forged by courage, strengthened by truth, and blessed with the kind of happiness that can only come from doing what's right, no matter the cost. Dodge City had indeed been changed forever, but it was a change for the better. A transformation from a town ruled by fear to a community bound together by hope, justice, and the unshakable belief that every child deserves to be loved and protected. And as the sun set over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the lonely rancher knew that this was just the beginning of their story, a story of redemption, love, and the courage to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.